glass of water on you this time.
No, you were very nice to me this time. How come?
Things are going really well. It's very much like akin to giving birth when you have a book like this, and this has been an incredible labor. I concocted this thing as a result of people giving me briefings about the history of our solar system, and it's a very strange story that starts with people that had extremely high technology, apparently some 2+ billion years ago, and they used a material called transparent aluminum and built these obelisks and pyramids on moons, not only all over our solar system, but apparently at least 12 or 13 neighboring stars as well. So this was a very, very prolific and widespread civilization, and then they just vanished. And that's what everybody calls the ancient builder race. And when you start talking to people on the inside, everybody knows about this thing. And I'd never really heard about this before 2014. And then I got this authorized disclosure from the United States government from a high-ranking official who'd worked in both the Reagan and the Clinton administrations. And he gave me all this stuff, and he said, David, we don't want to put this on the news, so we're going to hand it to people like you, and then you get to put it out there first, and then later on we're going to come in and prove that you're right. Well, that part hasn't happened yet. But I did my due diligence, and I took what they told me, and I tried to combine it with as much scientific research as possible. And ultimately what we're doing is we're charting the history of a refugee group that apparently crash-landed on Earth 55,000 years ago and became what most people are now calling the New World Order. These people apparently do trace themselves back to a race of extraterrestrials that came here. Basically, they got marooned. Their ships, they were in a war, they got shot at, their ships were billowing fire and smoke, and they crashed on Earth, and they didn't have enough techie guys to be able to figure out how to rebuild them to get off the planet again.
And nobody came to save them, I guess.
Nobody came to save them. In fact, people were coming to kill them, so they had to go and hide. And this is all considered common history. So I really feel, as far out in sci-fi as all this is, I'm really just trying to be a historian. And there apparently are many ET groups that have been refugees here, some of which interbred, some of which did not. And this is really just tracing the one that has the most intrigue for us now because they happen to be running the financial system and a lot of Western governments.
Now, David, the intriguing part of this book is the subtitle, as far as I'm concerned, because revealing the cosmic battle between good and evil. Tell me about that battle.
We're starting to get into it right now in terms of what I'm describing with this refugee group that crashed here. There's a very interesting process involved in ascension. And ascension, of course, is not just a Judeo-Christian concept. Ascension is something that appears in Islam, it appears in Buddhism, it appears in Hinduism, it appears in Jainism, it appears in Celtic lore, it appears in Irish mythology, Native American spirituality, you name it. 35 different ancient cultures around the world, as you always hear me saying, because this goes back to something Graham Hancock was writing about back in 95. 35 different ancient cultures all talk about ascension, and they all give a very similar setup that includes this idea of a massive cycle of 25,000 years on Earth and that it wraps up at the end. Well, what is ascension? Ascension is ultimately the spontaneous evolution of the human being into a higher form. And if you want to get to what that means, you got to look at things like the teachings of Christ. And I'm not a Christian here. I'm not trying to push one religion. I mean, I have very strong sympathy with Christianity in terms of the core message that it teaches, because I think that message is dead on the money. But I also don't want to disregard the value of other contributions from other teachers.
Right.
So I think that when we look at this thing, ultimately how loving we are, how kind we are, how compassionate and forgiving we are is the key. And we're in kind of a matrix or hologram in which there are adversarial forces, both in terms of what we would think of as spiritual and in terms of what we would think of as extraterrestrial, in which case they're more flesh and blood based, and also people on Earth who help them, i.e. the New World Order cabal folks. And this battle is very real, and the negative has every incentive to try to keep us enslaved because they actually feed on that. We generate an energy that they use for sustenance. They call it loosh.
Loosh?
Yep, and it's based on Lucifer. That's where it comes from.
Oh, boy.
So loosh is what we generate when we have anger, when we have fear, when we have jealousy, possessiveness, competitiveness, stress, pain, depression. All those things that we think of as just stuff that we run into every day, they vitally require it for their survival. And this is where it starts to sound like some cheesy B science fiction movie, and I get that. But I'll tell you what, George, after 20, 30 years of investigation, 20 years of very active being online, you get enough different people that all tell you the same thing, and they can prove that they worked with presidents and their administrations, and they can show you their military paperwork and validation, and they show you pictures of things that they're not supposed to have and documents that they're not supposed to have and so on. And you meet, let's say, 15 or 20 different people like that, and they all start telling you the same stuff. After a while, you got to use Occam's razor, the old philosophical
That's right.
argument that, it's probably true. But the story is just so huge, and this battle between good and evil, it's playing out every day. It's playing out on the headlines, and it explains a lot of things that are so mysterious.
Can you predict what side will win?
Yeah, I think that, well, first of all, okay, that's actually a more difficult question than it might appear to be.
Sure.
Because everybody gets what they need out of this event. And the event is some kind of energetic release from the sun. And in this book, I don't know if you got through the whole thing, and I'm not going to grill you on the air about that. It's 500 pages long. So.
It's huge. and I'll tell you the truth. I didn't get through the whole thing.
Okay. Well, I didn't expect.
I planned to read it on my plane back to L.A.
That's pretty confident. You think you can blow it out in a plane ride?
Really?
Well, look, there's some really interesting stuff where I start to go into new data that I've never revealed before in describing not only some ancient religious prophecies, but then prophecies that iterated into Greek and Roman philosophy. And what do I mean by that? The oldest religion on earth is Zoroastrianism. And you could kind of say that Zoroastrianism and Hinduism both emerged from one single common origin, which appears to be in what's now Siberia. And those people originally were living in a more tropical place before the earth moved its position, causing a terrible cataclysm that we call the Atlantean flood or the Noah's flood in the Bible. And these people had to migrate south where it was warmer, and one strain became the Hindus and one strain became the Zoroastrians. Well, these people were very well aware that the sun gives off a big flash of energy and light at the end of these great cycles that they talk about. What I didn't realize until I started to do research for this book is that science continues forward into Greek and Roman philosophy, where it's known as ekpyrosis. And the scholarship on ekpyrosis, up until I wrote this book, and I think a lot of people are going to look at it now, it was so obscure that I was finding scientific papers that only had 23 hits. And yet they're like so relevant to everything that everybody on Coast is talking about. Because these are Roman and Greek philosophers who absolutely believe that the sun gives off some big flash of light and energy at the end of the cycle, and that it completely changes what it means to be human. And that is the center of gravity that all this other stuff is orbiting around. It's a very interesting discussion because we like to think of a steady state universe in which everything just kind of keeps ambling along and does its thing, and it's boring, and it's, I can pretty much see where this is going. Actually not. If the sun does this thing that the Zoroastrians told us about, and the Hindus told us about, and Jesus tells us about, and Buddha told us about it, and everybody tells us about it, the ancient teachings. If the sun actually does this, it's, okay, let's go to the Quran, right? The Muslim Bible.
All right.
It says that time stops, and that is also reflected in the Egyptian scriptures, including things like the Emerald Tablets and some other scriptures as well. Time stops. Time comes to an end as we know it. It's a dimensional shift. There's some sort of fundamental change in the way that time processes for us. And apparently, once we go through this, we will have lifespans that are much longer. We'll experience time differently, so that, and again, I'm going to use the Bible a lot, but a year becomes like 1,000 years. So, in other words, you could live for what we would think of as 80 years of our time, but now it's like 80,000 years.
Or almost somewhat like Methuselah.
Exactly. So then the weird part is that once we go through this change, we also may develop, we may gain access to extraterrestrial technology that's widely in use all around us right now. And these people have made a unified agreement not to show themselves to us at this time. They can only give us little mysteries and occasional sightings, which, of course, these days, even a very good quality sighting can be disputed on YouTube because of the ubiquitous presence of motion graphics and computer animation. You don't know if anything's real anymore. It would take a very massive sighting over a major urban area that, thousands of people film with their cameras from different angles. That's what it would take to really break the wall down.
Didn't we get that in 97 with the Phoenix Lights, David?
We got it in 97. We got it in Mexico City, 1991. We got it in 1945 with the Battle of Los Angeles. We got it in whatever it was, with the Fatima sightings of Portugal, where 90,000 people see a silver disc. This is around 1914.
They actually thought it was the sun coming down, which I think is a little ludicrous. I think it was a flying disc.
Yeah, and it created rainbow colors all throughout the sky. And after this event was over, it had been soaking wet. Everybody was soaked to the skin, and yet when the craft disappeared, everybody's clothes were completely bone dry. And that is obviously an advanced technology. They called it a miracle. They also saw what appeared to be flowers coming out of the sky, but they were holograms because when they hit the ground, they disappear. Little white flowers.
That's right.
So, look, 90,000 people saw this. The Battle of Los Angeles, over 1,000 eyewitnesses. Apparently over 1 million people actually witnessed it to some degree. They took the craft that was seen and they put a little periscope on the top, and that's what you see in the movie version of War of the Worlds. So, but it's just that, 1952, right? You have a whole fleet of ships that fly over Congress. If that had happened now with people's camera phones, it would be all over.
Oh, sure would.
So we're just waiting for the big one. And I think once that happens, well, I don't think, it's pretty obvious that everything changes. And if you just look at what's happened in the last couple of days, George, and I'm sure you probably talked about this on your show, and I may be redundant here, but just like you haven't read my whole book, I haven't listened to your whole show. So there you go.
Oh, but you have listened to the whole show.
Well, in the last few days, they're telling us, and when I say they now, I mean mainstream media outlets that are taking their hints from things like AP, Associated Press, with the wire service, right? The nearest star to Earth, Proxima Centauri, 4 light years away.
Great story.
Probably has an Earth-like planet around it that may actually have an intelligent human-like civilization living on it already. And at the same time that they're telling us this, they tell us that SETI is now analyzing a WOW signal coming off of a nearby star.
Found by the Russians.
Uh-huh. And at the same time that they're telling us this, they're saying, we found some weird physics thing that allows us to get to near light speed with this microwave engine that we can stick on the end of a rocket and then start traveling around the galaxy. And here's this science geek who's published a paper in a mainstream science journal explaining that, yeah, well, the photon is violating the laws of physics that we know, but basically it just kind of becomes invisible and does its own thing. But, yeah, it works. It's a propulsion system. Why are they telling us all three of these things at the same time? If you have the benefit to be able to bend the ears of insiders like I do, then what we're hearing is that on Earth there has been a fierce battle between dispossessed elements from the Pentagon that got kicked out by the cabal and ended up forming an alliance outside the governmental structure. And there's a lot of them. And they're doing this with foreign countries. America is very much involved in this. Apparently, as I've been saying, a sizable majority of certain branches of the intelligence services and the military in America is actually working to uphold their oath of enlistment, which says to defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Okay, they're doing that. And I just watched them again the other night. You watch movies, the Marvel movies, Iron Man 3 and Captain America, Winter Soldier. You don't believe there's an alliance? Well, just watch those movies. It's crazy how much they reveal about this column in the military that's working against these globalists. And what they're doing is they're getting ready to tell us. And even the cabal themselves knows that they're out of time. They're going to have to tell us the truth. So these things, this Proxima Centauri thing and the SETI WOW signal and the microwave engine, all of that stuff is getting ready for what they call a partial disclosure. And what that means is that they are going to show us ships that they already have that can go around the solar system. They're going to introduce us to astronauts who fly in them. It's going to be very public. And they may not do this right away because they want to try to roll this thing out over a period of time. But then we find out that movies like 2001 were real. And they found these crystalline obelisks and objects on various moons, including the Earth's moon.
That's dramatic stuff. David, we're going to take a quick break, but we're going to come back. David Wilcock, our special guest tonight, his latest work is called The Ascension Mysteries. His website, divinecosmos.com, linked up at coasttocoastam.com. When we come back, we'll continue talking with him about this difference between good and evil. And also, he's got some incredible information of the secret space program. And welcome back to Coast to Coast. David Wilcock with us, his book, The Ascension Mysteries. It's an amazing book, and it is a huge book, but it talks about the battle between good and evil. And, David, I want to talk a little bit more about that and then get into the secret space program. And, of course, you and Corey Good do programs for the Gaia Television Network that are just riveting as well. You've been doing this for a long time, but you went through some personal struggles yourself, did you not?
Absolutely. The whole first half of the book is a description of that.
And how did you pull yourself up from the bootstraps to get to where you are now?
Well, in the book I describe how we are all living, I was born in 1973. I'm 43 years old now. I grew up in the mass nuclear suicide cult portion of American history. They could fry us at any time. It's very likely, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it. So just, we had these nuclear war drills at school, which they called an air raid drill. But this is a lot more than an air raid, and, I don't really know what the heck it's going to do when you hide under your desk and cover your head.
Not going to work.
Mushroom cloud is coming.
I know it. Not going to work.
It's crazy, right? And then there was this thing on TV called The Day After. And my parents wouldn't let me watch it because, it's so scary. I went down, it was 1983, and I went up and I watched it. I was 10 years old. And I saw the scenes, and I'm like, I don't need to watch this. It was just scenes of mass destruction. The world had been nuked. And what people don't realize is that the people that put this kind of stuff out, they're aware that our thoughts are a lot more powerful than we realize. And so the cabal folks are trying to use the power of our consciousness against us. They're leveraging that against us. That's what's so shocking about this. They're not coming at it from a perspective of ignorance. They're coming at it from a perspective of great wisdom, and they use our ignorance for profit. So I have a personal story in that, because you read my life account as it's described in this book, and I do basically take it from birth straight up through until I was 19, when I started to break into the UFO stuff and get insiders. And I started out as a very advanced child prodigy.
Were you good in school?
Oh, yeah. I mean, everybody hated me. Everybody hated me.
That's why I walked out on paying for your lunch.
And I still haven't been paid back by you.
No, you haven't.
After all this time.
Really, kids did not like you in school?
Oh, my God, no. I was bringing a book to school that was how to develop your ESP ever since I was 7 years old.
Oh, my gosh.
I put a white piece of paper over it and wrote free reading on it, and if you take the book, you can still see the indentation where it says free reading if you hold it under a light. And I also, the other thing I kept bringing to school was a monthly magazine called Odyssey, where they took, like, NASA stories and photographs about various astronomy issues and wrote them for kids.
Did teachers think that you were a little weird?
Well, yeah. In second grade, I did a classroom demonstration of my ESP for the whole class. How many kids have done that?
That's right. And I assume it worked.
Yeah, I had a psychic club. I talk about this in the book, where the kids, I had a group of, like, I forget how many exactly. I think there was 4 kids, maybe 5, and I'm not going to say their names, but I definitely remember who they are. And one of them was my buddy who I was hanging out with all the time, and we'd already been doing this stuff on our own. And they would go around the corner of the building, and they'd pick a number 1 through 10, and they'd all agree that that was the number, and then they'd come back around, and I would just take the first number in my head, and I'd tell them the number, and it was right. And I had 100% accuracy.
Amazing.
And they tried to fool me by coming up with a fake number and then saying, you know, we'll pick the real number now, and then next time we'll pick a fake number, because they thought maybe somehow I could hear them talking, even though they were far, far away, and there's no way that sound could have traveled like that. So they gave me, they come up, and I pick the number, and they're like, yeah, you're right. And they walk away dejected. And then I see one of the kids, who ended up being a friend of mine later. He had blonde hair, and he leans into the others, and he starts whispering, and I knew something fishy was going on. And then all of a sudden I get this big flash of, it was the number 7, I believe, and it was all in stage lights like you see at a rock concert. And it just goes, and I see this in my head, and I say, okay, you guys, come on back. You already picked the next number, and it's 7. And they were so shocked that instead of being excited about this or doing anything with it, they never wanted to have a psychic club meeting again. The club basically disbanded.
Jeez. You were too good.
It scared them.
Yeah.
They didn't expect it.
They didn't know how to handle it.
And then my closest buddy, Eric, and I use his name in the book, you know, his parents were fundamentalist Christian, and they quickly ended up not wanting him to do anything with me either. We continued to stay friends, but we didn't do our psychic stuff anymore.
Did they think you were like a devil worshiper or something?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But what I had done is I'd seen this HBO documentary on Nostradamus and said, well, heck, you know, if this guy could do it, you know, he's a human being, then ostensibly other human beings could do this as well. And if I can do it, then maybe if I keep practicing, I'll get to the point where I could be like Nostradamus. And maybe I'll be able to help stop a war. And, you know, these tools might be useful. So why would I want to hog this? I want to teach other people how to be psychic so that we have a better chance of avoiding a nuclear war. And that was my plan. But none of the kids wanted to learn. They were too scared of it.
Because some people believe that you are the reincarnated Edgar Cayce, the great American prophet, at what point in your life did you start thinking maybe you were?
That didn't occur until 1997, and it was in the summer, where I had been working with a hypnotherapist named Skip Weatherford, and he put me under hypnosis, and I was doing readings at the time. I'd been doing them for a year, and the readings started to pull the questions that he was going to ask me out of his head before he could speak them. And for him, that was the TKO. All resistance to the idea of what was going on being fake, all resistance to the idea of what was going on being real was gone, because this can't be done. Somebody can't just read your mind and answer your question without you having to say it out loud. And after that, he says, you got to come over to my house right now. And I go over there eventually, because I resisted at first. And then he throws this magazine cover down, and it's got a piece of white paper over the top, and there's a square cut out of the middle, and there's a face in the square, and it's an old photo from the early 20th century of a guy with a really tall, like 2.5-inch tall, starched collar. And other than that, obviously antiquated detail, it's my face, exactly. And he says, "No, who's that?" And I knew he was a member of the ARE, the Cayce Group, and they have a magazine called Venture Inward, and I knew that he was a subscriber to that magazine. I said, well, I'm thinking it through, saying, well, that's got to be Venture Inward, and that's got to be a picture of Edgar Cayce. And I say, well, that's Edgar Cayce. And he says, yeah, but who else does it look like? Then I went to Virginia Beach in October of 1997, and all of the high-level Cayce people working for their organization, including the director of their magazine, the art director of the magazine, people of that level, all were recognizing me as Cayce reincarnated.
Had they met you before?
No. I moved there because I believed that the Cayce readings may have been right about the prophecy that California was going to sink into the ocean in 1998. Gordon Michael Scallion was on Coast to Coast a lot back then, and
that's right.
He seemed pretty convincing at the time. He turned out to be very wrong. But he was convinced everything was going in 1998, and I said, well, if Cayce said that Virginia Beach is a safety land, then that's where I want to be. So I'm going to get there before 98. But then later on, I found out that Cayce had been influenced by a negative entity called Halaliel, and that those readings that talk about California sinking were from the negative entity. Most of the people that wrote books about Cayce didn't realize that his own group later repudiated those prophecies and said they're not true.
Well, are they not true because of the date, or are they not true because of the event itself?
Well, it does appear that we may have some type of earth change scenario, but the time was certainly wrong.
Right, big time.
And what you experience as this goes on really has to do with what timeline you're on. And if you're on a positive timeline, then you won't experience any catastrophes. It's like a break in the flow of time in which what you experience is essentially what you've invited. And apparently only the most evil folks are actually going to see some kind of catastrophic event take place. And we may not even, if we're on the other timeline, we may not even realize that timeline occurred. That's how strange this thing is.
Well, it's uncanny, the resemblance, ever since we interviewed you and Winfrey about this.
Well, I want to point out, just so people don't get the wrong idea, the book doesn't even go into that. That's later in the story. This book kind of
is this book you're talking about,
yeah.
Right?
The reincarnation of Edgar Cayce book's already been written. My next book that I write all by myself will probably get into all that stuff in a lot more depth.
Okay. Now, let's talk about the secret space program.
Sure.
You have looked at this for some time with Corey Good. You've got a program on the Gaia Television Network that has startled a lot of people. What do we know about this secret space program, David?
Well, let's go back through time for a little bit, and let's talk about the idea that Atlantis is not the only civilization that rose to prominence on Earth. There's been many, many, many of them. And they rise and they fall.
They rise and they fall. And some before Atlantis.
Oh, many before Atlantis.
Yeah.
And that's actually what the Egyptian priesthood told Solon, who then told Plato, which Plato leaked when he wrote Timaeus and Critias and got in so much trouble for it. That's where the term Atlantis came into the common lexicon. So they said, the priests of Egypt said that there had been many other civilizations. And in those civilizations, it's very common that a breakaway group forms in which a higher level of technology is developed than what the people have, and those people form a closed elite. They go out into space. Pretty soon they discover the ancient builder race stuff. They discover all these really cool obelisks and pyramids made out of crystalline material on moons and planets that are all throughout our solar system. Most of the moons in our solar system have these things, apparently.
Mm-hmm.
And they break away, and then if there's some kind of catastrophic event on Earth, they're not there for it, and they're off on somewhere other place where they're safe. So you have to understand that this idea of a secret space program is way more complex than most people's imagination can tolerate without some coaching, because we are surrounded by dozens and dozens and dozens of different extraterrestrial civilizations that not only visit us, but this is their home. And that's a very important point. There is such a need for space, for living space on the moon, that the backside of the moon is just developed out as much as you can handle. There's no space left that hasn't been settled. And apparently, according to some insiders we have coming out of the Russian side of things, it's so busy on the night side of the moon right now that it looks like Manhattan at night. It's just totally loaded with light because there's so many different groups there. And there's also a very interesting phenomenon about the Earth in which it has a honeycomb-like structure where there are literally millions of giant cavities as you go down below the surface, and it can be miles below the surface. But once you get into these cavities, this interesting little rule of biological life in nature is that these cavities have these weird white mushrooms and little white crustaceans and things like that can live in there, and they have a bioluminescent bacteria on the roof that actually provides light. And so, sure enough, you can go in there, even in its natural state, and you can start with that, and you can develop it, and with a little technology, you can bring in trees and animals and plants and all the stuff we have on the surface and actually live in there.
That's pretty dramatic.
And there are a lot of different civilizations that are actually living inside the planets in our solar system. And they do that because the surface isn't necessarily the safest place to be for very long.
No.
And if you process time differently, if 1,000 years is like 1 year, then a 25,000-year cycle where the sun gives off a big flash of energy, that might only be 25 years for you. You don't want to be sitting around on the surface and waiting for that thing.
David, the late remote viewer, Ingo Swann, in his works, always talked about structures on the far side of the moon, to the point where, he was totally convinced that something was there. So it's got to have some credence here.
What I've done with this book is I'm not trying to say take my word for it. As much as possible, I am bringing in the evidence. I'm bringing in photographic proof, such as what's called the Blair Cuspids, a group of obelisks that were photographed on the moon. You can see the shadows coming off of them. They're clearly obelisks. And there's these rectangular pits in the ground around where they are. And those rectangles would represent rectangular rooms under the surface that the meteors hitting the moon and causing craters have smashed in the roof because they're so old that they're kind of falling apart. So I have physical evidence as well as bringing in as many different whistleblowers who have talked about this as I possibly can, quoting from them, correlating what they say, putting it all together. It was a massive amount of effort that went into this thing. And they're all saying the same stuff. They're all telling us that there's very, very ancient ruins in our solar system and in neighboring solar systems. Somebody built this stuff a long time ago. Many other groups have come in since then, and this technology that's the really old stuff is actually better than theirs.
Why hide it from us?
Power and control. It's that simple. When you are trying to establish yourself as a dominant force, you don't want there to be a bigger alpha male on the block. You want to be the bully. You want to be the guy that everybody pays tribute to, tribute payments as well, pay you for protection. So, to a large degree, running an effective government is being an effective alpha that everybody wants to finance so that he'll protect you. But if you can say, hey, you know what? There's aliens, and we don't have anything we can do against them, and they're just going to come and go as they choose and pluck people off the planet.
And that's what's happening.
Guys? We got nothing. We
can't stop them.
That's not going to work out too good, you know. Apparently, recently, the military-industrial complex actually has developed ships that can take down these Draco reptilians, which I'm sure David Icke is going to be talking about tomorrow night.
Yeah, yep.
And, you know, they actually are now at parity with them. They have a comparable level of technology to actually shoot them down out of the sky, and that's part of what's happening right now. It's a very exciting time.
Is that smart to do that, David? Shooting them down?
It wouldn't have been before. But we're in a very different era now because we are being assisted so that we can go through this change with a minimum of discomfort and without the classic alien invasion scenario or the so-called New World Order takeover where we all get to go camping, and I'm not talking about out in the cabin in the woods.
We're going to come back in a moment with David Wilcock. We're going to take phone calls, but also get into the title of his new book, The Ascension Mysteries, and talk more about that and explaining the abilities that we will have as an ascended race. What does that all mean? David's next with us with your calls on Coast to Coast AM. And David Wilcock, our special guest, we're going to come back and talk with him about Ascension, the meaning of his title, The Ascension Mysteries, and we'll take your calls on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast, David Wilcock with us and your calls. David, Ascension, tell me what you mean by that, Ascension.
Well, I think this is really the focal point of the whole discussion. That's why I called the book The Ascension Mysteries. There's different takes on it, and I don't really push a particular interpretation on my reader, but I do offer perspective on what these teachings tell us. And in the other two books, I really kind of focused on more of a gradual scenario, whereas in this book, I focus a lot more on the data pointing towards a spontaneous scenario. And by spontaneous, I mean if you're ready for it, you end up transforming into a higher level of human evolution, and the prophecies suggest that it may not happen immediately, but that within a reasonable time that we will be able to have things like telekinesis and teleportation just with the power of the mind, telepathy, all these really astonishing abilities that would normally be seen as only the purview of masters and yogis and saints. They become things that we all can do. And that's a very exciting future. The universe isn't going to give you these gifts if you're not responsible enough to be able to handle them. And I think that's the key, is we all have to grow up and learn not to war with each other and fight with each other. And the seeming powerlessness that we have over these geopolitical events on the global stage ultimately inspire us to change on the personal level, and that's where it really counts. That's where the ascension process really happens. It's not something that you just sit around waiting to see. It's very much a daily, active, transformative process involving engaging in your own spiritual work and doing the hard work of learning to love and accept others and forgive them for the things that they're doing, because it's a very challenging, ongoing process.
And, of course, Jesus ascended as well. So is there some similarities there?
Well, if you look at the Casey reading, since you brought it up already, he described his readings, which seem to be coming from a very high source, described Jesus as our elder brother, and that they also say Jesus is the pattern. And what they mean is, and there is actually one quote in the Bible that wasn't sanitized where Jesus says, and it's John 14:12, where Jesus says, "As I do these things," meaning the miracles, "so will you do these things, and greater things." So clearly, he's not the only one that has these abilities, and this notion of a second coming of Christ seems to be not just one messianic figure, as people often describe it, but a variety of people who start to have this happen to them and are then able to do things to dramatically tip the scales on earth in our favor.
What do you think of end times prophecy, David?
I think it's very reflective of realities that we're already seeing. We've had the hottest summer on record. We are having wars and rumors of wars. We're having wailing and gnashing of teeth. We're having mass starvation, droughts, epidemics, financial destitution, all the stuff that if you go back to what the Hindus said about the Kali Yuga, Buddhist end-time prophecy, Islamic end-time prophecy, Christian end-time prophecy, Judaism, I mean, it's all over the place. The Hopi prophecy, I mean, everybody basically described a world that becomes increasingly polarized, where the contrast between good and evil becomes so obvious. And of course, the New Agers and White Lighters are going to say, oh, there's no evil and you need to just love the evil. But look, if you get abducted by reptilians and pulled into the galactic slave trade, I don't think you'd be saying that there's no evil.
No.
So,
no.
There are some real things that we have to contend with, and in the greater sense, the spiritual teachings tell us that this is all a big hologram, and it's all identity, and there's only one identity, which is the creator of the universe, ultimately, and we're all iterations of that in our own way, with only, we do have free will, but ultimately how we treat others is how we treat ourselves. And that's the real cosmic awakening that we get, is when the individuality starts to break down, we begin to perceive ourselves as interconnected with others. That's growing up. That's maturity. That's ascension. Ascension is realizing that we're not separate people and what we do to others directly affects us.
And you claim that we have extraterrestrial DNA in our system.
Absolutely. That's a widely held notion in the insider community, and there's also poignant data in the real world that validates that. We found very bizarre skeletons with elongated skulls all over the planet, everywhere from South Africa in the Boskop area to Omsk, Siberia. You see these people in the Egyptian pharaohs, in the sculptures and paintings and carvings of them. You see them in Peru. There's a variety of skulls that have been found in Peru and Bolivia and Brazil and these other places that have those characteristics. When I was at Contact in the Desert, we had Brian Forster there, and he's now saying that those skulls are being medically analyzed and they don't have the same number of fissures in the skull that ours do, and they have odd characteristics. Well, guess what? Those people were here. Most of the time when you find these skeletons, they're given honorable burials, clearly showing that they were people of public prominence. And it's very likely that they did interbreed with us. And therefore, to hear it from the insiders, we are a very hybridized human race. There's a lot of different DNA that has been mixed together to make us who we are today. And that's part of why we are so spring-loaded for ascension, is a lot of this DNA is like hot-wired for ascension. We're actually much more capable of ascending than most other races would be in terms of how fast and how powerful we will be once it happens.
All right, let's go to the calls. International line, Jillian in Markham, Ontario in Canada. Hi, Jill. Go ahead.
Hi. So great to talk to you and David.
Great.
Thanks, Jillian.
Yes. I'm wondering how we can help the ascension. I have friends that are going on raw vegan diets, and they say they're getting incredible amount of abilities because of this, cleaning out their body. and if you've heard of this.
Yeah, I did the vegan diet for 7 years, and I ultimately had to let go of it. I think that's a very important step in the right direction. My diet now would be considered paleo, and there are going to be whole groups of people that are up in arms when I say that, because veganism is like a religion. But I want to point out that the reason why you get such a payoff from doing it is that there are all these, what they actually call, and this is from guys that were in the Illuminati acting as whistleblowers who told me this, there are several different things in our regular food supply that they call weapons systems. And that would include citric acid as a preservative. Citric acid is extremely toxic. If you have it in its raw form, it has to be considered a hazardous material. Refined sugar, which is in so many things, all the corn syrup and all that stuff. MSG, which can show up as hydrolyzed soy protein, monosodium, all this kind of stuff. Then also, I don't know, there's so many. Wheat, you just can't eat wheat at all. It's very bad. Of course, corn is genetically modified. Dairy is really bad. So when vegans go vegan, they don't have dairy anymore. You're not getting all the growth hormones and all the weird stuff that they inject into the cows these days. So yeah, that diet will help you. What I do is I have a diet that has ethical meat blended back into it, but it has to be very high quality, where the animals are treated well, they're not put into any type of uncomfortable conditions. And so that makes my choices very limited. So my diet is still predominantly like a vegan, but I also use very high-quality protein sources at times.
Have you always watched what you eat?
No. I was very overweight from about 5th grade up until maybe the end of 10th grade.
Really?
Yeah, and that story of my weight loss and how I got over that when I was 16 years old is in the book.
Yeah. Were you chubby overweight?
Oh, yeah. No, I weighed 225 pounds at 5'9".
Jeez.
So, and that was not
healthy. No, you weren't on the football team,
yeah,
were you?
I had the moobs and the spare tire and all that.
Oh my gosh.
I was a heavy kid. And
you've done your metamorphosis, David.
Back in those days, nobody else was, and so I was the fat kid, and I got bullied and teased mercilessly for it.
Back to the cabal for a moment. Would you say the cabal is the evil part of the good evil?
I would say they're an aspect of it. The cabal ultimately is controlled by negative extraterrestrials. The main group that's controlling the negative extraterrestrials would be the Draco reptilians. They also have other groups that they are dominating that are extraterrestrial as well. But then the Draco actually have a god. They worship an AI, and the AI is ultimately controlling the Draco. And what we find out from many other extraterrestrial races is that the AI is ultimately what we would think of as Satan or Lucifer, and it's this force that will use biological life forms to do its biddings. Those forms end up getting injected with nanites that basically take over their body. You get super lifespan, you get super healing capabilities, you get super expansion of your mind, but you've lost your soul. And ultimately what the AI does is it destroys all biological life. And it seems that whatever this thing is, it exists in the spiritual form, but it cannot take flesh, because if it does, it's subject to judgment. And I know that sounds very Christian, but this is how it's been explained to me by some very high-level whistleblowers who identify as Christian, but they also work for the government. So there you have it.
All right. Let's go next to Thomas in La Jolla, California. Hey, Tom, go ahead.
Thank you for taking my call, George.
Sure thing.
And great interview tonight, David.
Thank you, Tom.
David, I wanted to ask you about, people, the cabal travels between the stars with hardware, but isn't the poor person's method of travel, isn't that through portals, through megalithic sites, power spots, power mountains here on the Earth? It's as if the Earth is riddled with portals that directly connect us to the universe, to other star systems, to other planets. The Native American traditions talk about portals at power spots such as Mount Shasta, Cuchama here in the San Diego area, and even in power spots, in the Southwest, etc., in England, in France, in Asia. These power spots connect us directly because they are portals. You go to the power spot, whether it's Giza Plateau, Göbekli Tepe, Baalbek, etc., Stonehenge, and at certain times you can step through into another world, another star system. And I was wondering if you would comment on that as opposed to hardware, spacecraft, that maybe the techniques of travel between the stars are already there, existing as portals all over.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I could do a 2-hour dissertation easily and only do a basic outline to answer your question. So let me see if I can do an elevator version.
In 2 minutes.
Yeah. The new book, Ascension Mysteries, is essentially a companion volume to my original book, The Source Field Investigations, which is a cosmic encyclopedia, has over 1,000 academic references. And I do get heavily into portals in both of those books. The new Ascension Mysteries book has a lot of stuff on this. But to go back to Source Field for a minute, what we're ultimately dealing with is sacred geometry that appears as resonant fields in the gravitational field, actually. So they're like waves in gravity, and they're invisible, but they exert force, and they actually shape the continents and the mountain ranges and the undersea volcanic ridges on Earth. And there are all different levels of geometry depending on where you're looking, and it's when they cross, because they all rotate at different speeds, and that's geometry inside the Earth as well as geometry in the alignment of the planets. When certain alignments take place, you get these bubbles that actually glow. They give off light. And if you happen to go inside one of those bubbles, you could portal. But the question is, can you control where it's going to go? And so a lot of these ancient sites, their basic purpose is to harness those bubbles, to draw them in at the times that they're formed. But then what we now know from high-level insiders like Corey Good is that the priesthoods would have these special tools, such as things made out of solid gold, and those tools are very important in terms of knowing where you're going once you step into that ball of light. Because if you don't have one of those tools and you don't have a highly developed consciousness, you could very easily get lost somewhere in space and never come back.
Remember the movie Contact with Jodie Foster, okay?
I had lunch with the guy that wrote that movie today because he's working on my new film.
Really?
Bring that up, yeah.
How about that?
Yep.
Talk about synchronicity.
I mean, we're 3 weeks away from finishing Convergence. Thank God, finally, after all these years.
It's taken you a long time, but it'll be worth waiting for.
Yeah, and we got a bunch of financiers lined up who want to work with A-list screenwriters, and they want to do disclosure films, and so things are looking really good right now.
Good for you, David. Did he talk a little bit about Contact and what he meant by that wormhole for travel? An incredible propulsion system.
Yeah, that is essentially, he didn't know, let's just put it clearly, he didn't know that this was based on truth. And we talk a lot about why did she see an apparition of her father, even though it clearly was some other being that was not her father. And that and he says this is how it's been done for billions of years. That's
right. And they're looking for the same thing we're looking for.
Yeah. And that's just a very accurate reflection of what's really going on. Jim is working on another film with a major UFO personality. I can't say who it is yet because it's, these things are governed by proprietary agreements.
Of course.
Speak about them, but I'm just really excited that he's doing my film. And I mean, we did not plan this. It's really funny that you would bring that up because I literally I had to take a big bite out of my schedule and drive down to Santa Monica. We had lunch at True Food Kitchen. And I had the salmon, and he had the salmon, and we had our little drinks and talked about the film, and basically, sealed up all the plot details. And he thinks that this could be one of the best things he's ever written. So coming from the guy that wrote Contact, that's pretty exciting.
That is exciting, David. David, give out your website, and where can people get the big book, The Ascension Mysteries?
Sure. I have two websites now. One is divinecosmos.com, DIVINECOSMOS.
That's the one you've had for a while, right?
Yeah, and the new one is DWilcock, DWILCOCK.com, and that's where I'm giving people Ascension updates that might be too sensitive for me to put out on a public website normally. So there's like an email sign-up on that one.
Okay.
I also, of course, have the new book that's come out. It's in audio form, it's in Kindle form, and it's also in hardcover. However, this week, up until, I guess, September 6th, if you're thinking about buying it at all, right now is the time to do it, because it costs less and it ensures that we get on the bestseller list. And that's important because we're trying to get this thing into mainstream credibility. If I'm lucky, I'll be able to announce very soon one of the most famous rock stars ever on Earth is going to be endorsing my book with a tweet and a picture of himself holding it. And we've been talking about this. I was on the phone with him for 2 hours the other night. I hope he does it. I think he's going to, and that will be great.
Is his first name Tom?
No.
All right. We're going to come back and take final calls with David Wilcock on Coast to Coast AM. On our next Coast to Coast program, Doc Wallach joins us for the first couple hours from criticalhealthnews.com, followed by David Icke. So you don't want to miss that show. We shall be back in a moment. And welcome back. Our final segment with David Wilcock as we talk about his work, The Ascension Mysteries. David, how long have you been working on this book?
Wow. I guess the initial disclosure of this grand story of the cosmic history of our solar system, which I've only barely touched on so far, came to me in August 2014. But it was essentially informing work that I've been doing in terms of studying whistleblower testimony and talking to them myself for 20 years. So everybody wants to know, what do your insiders say? What's the deepest intel you can give us? And in my other two books, I tried to satisfy the skeptics who only want things that are scientifically provable, whereas in this book, I really just come out with all of the insider stuff. So it's like full disclosure in the book, and I try to map on the science to it as much as I can, and the extraterrestrial archaeology we see on various planets and moons, and all that stuff fuses together. So I think people are going to say this is my best book. It's certainly going to be the most sci-fi and interesting in terms of its scope and the depth. I'm very pleased with how it's turned out. So it's at least 20 years in the making, really.
You know, as the Bible talks about good and evil, they talk about the fallen angels and such. Do you think that really happened, or were we talking about extraterrestrials?
Fallen angels are extraterrestrials, as far as what these government officials are telling me.
Yeah.
And, they might have their own agenda. They might not be entirely truthful, but I tried to take their words and put them to task, and there's a lot of evidence that there was an extraterrestrial civilization here on Earth of refugees that did, in fact, crash land and had these elongated skulls, 300 IQ, larger brains, that they took over various continents that they landed on all over the planet and formed kingships and royal bloodlines, and that, in fact, some of them are still here. And apparently they exist in certain places where they wear these elongated hats, certain cities or cities within nations. And, it's a very contentious subject, but there are whistleblowers who I describe in the book, like Karen Hughes, who had somebody that met with leaders of the financial system, and one of these guys had a very strange elongated skull and very piercing blue eyes.
All right, let's go to
anything like a regular person.
Let's go to the final calls here for you, Mr. Wilcock. Let's go east of the Rockies. Don in Augusta, Georgia. Hey, Don, you're up with us. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. The nice topic is great, and y'all doing a good job. I can't agree with you more about what you're saying about fear being used as a way of controlling and manipulating people. I think when somebody's under stress or in fear, they can't use their abilities. And I noticed when I quit watching the mainstream news so much, I get all my news from George, and I quit drinking fluoride and some other things, my paranormal abilities just went through the roof.
Absolutely.
I can read people's minds and think clear, and I think I've been in fear my whole life, worried about getting in an accidental nuclear war or some kind of event, and just, if I can get this fear off my back, I can use my abilities better.
Well, once you get rid of that fear, then you're no longer providing these negative entities with the food supply that they're using our planet as a farm for. That's really the bottom line, as crazy as it sounds.
They live on fear, don't they?
They actually do.
They feed it, they grow with it, they nurture it, and everything else.
And one of the contentious points is, why would a loving God create a universe this way? And the answer is that the hero's journey, the struggle between good and evil, is written into the cosmic nature of the universe itself. And I really go into that in my second book, Synchronicity Key, go into all the details about Hollywood screenwriting and that every movie is basically the same hero's journey story. And you have to have a villain. And so the villain is given an incentive to do evil because they require it. And they either have the option ultimately of going positive, or else they essentially dissolve back into the pure energy of the universe. So you can't stay evil, but you can choose that path, and you can get power from black magic, and it really works.
David, why was the God of the Bible so evil? And let me rephrase that. I can't say evil, but so aggressively mean about things.
Specifically, you would be referring to Yahweh in the Old Testament.
Right.
And this is an area where the Law of One goes into detail about it in saying that Moishi, or Moses, was originally in contact with a positive entity, but because he was doing psychic parlor tricks and having people say, hey, man, take your staff and turn it into a snake, and he said, sure, check it out, that he ultimately lost his positivity from that, which, again, is contentious. It's a very contentious subject, but this is what the Law of One says, that the negative Yahweh was able to, it wasn't actually named Yahweh at all. It took that name, and that's the angry God of the Old Testament. The angry God of the Old Testament is a Draco. And so you're going to see all of this Draco type of stuff that it's saying and doing, like I will smite thy firstborn, and I will bathe you in blood, and all this kind of crazy stuff.
Isn't a Draco a reptilian?
Yes.
And didn't they also confuse the Draco as the devil?
Yes. I mean, the Draco live in underground bases. They have vertical slit pupils and reptilian skin, and Christians have been saying that Satan lives in hell and hell is underground. And so there is some kind of weird,
that's amazing,
subconscious telepathic thing where we're tapping into something that's true.
West of the Rockies, Wayne in Tacoma, Washington. You're on with David Wilcock. Wayne, hi.
Good evening, gentlemen. David, I wanted to ask you if you think that the psychic abilities that you have can be achieved by people, perhaps maybe men's of people or something that can tap into other things, like Dr. Doom teaches, his program.
Remote viewing, yeah.
I believe that, intuitive ability, I just want to say this at the outset. I don't think that I have any special DNA or special power. I was fortunate enough to get into this and start reading books on how to develop ESP when I was 7, and I began practicing the exercises. And it was only after I practiced the exercises that I had my psychic club and that I did classroom demonstrations. Before that, I only had natural ability, which a lot of kids do, and it wasn't anywhere near as sharp as it was once I practiced. And so once we get a more formal disclosure of the truth and people understand what's really going on, then they're going to see, Wayne, that our lives are made to have this ability. And it's been taken from us by disinformation, by lies, by fear, by telling us that it's evil or it's negative. But again, even if you're coming at it from a mainstream Christian perspective, if Jesus is saying in John 14:12, as I do these things, so shall ye do them, well, then Jesus is able to walk up to a woman and tell her who she cheated on her husband with and give the names. That's in the Bible. So if he could do that, then ultimately he's saying we'll be able to do those things as well.
Remarkable work that you continue to do, David. Does it come to you via whistleblowers, some of it?
That's a more recent phenomenon. I would say that originally, for many years, it was just straight-ahead academic research. And as a kid, I was doing a lot of academic research. I was reading books all the way back in 5th grade. I read a book from Francis Crick on DNA not being possibly random at all, but that it had to have been a divine design. I read a book called Body Language by Dr. Julius Fast when I was in 7th grade. It fascinated me because it talked about the subconscious and how it reveals itself in the way that we hold our bodies. I was reading books on lucid dreaming when I was a junior in high school, shamanism, all this kind of stuff. It was only later on when I found out that NASA knew that extraterrestrials were real since its inception and had been covering it up, that I began to very deliberately seek out people who had this knowledge. And for many years, I couldn't find them. And I was just a blogger writing stuff on the Internet back at a time when you basically had to have like a doctorate to be able to make a website. And I was lucky enough to get in early, and so people started to come to me because there really was nobody doing this back then. Very few people. And over the years, I built up a cadre of insiders who have impressive credentials. Many of them have come forward, others have not. And I just have tried to synergize everything they say together, both on cosmic disclosure and in this new book. I'm so excited. It's a major relief for me to finally be able to just tell the truth. And I'm not concerned about what the skeptics are going to say because I didn't write this for them.
Without the fallout.
Yeah, I mean, I've done 2 books that prove that I can show you. I mean, look, people wanted to give me an honorary PhD for the first book, just the first half of the first book, because you only need 120 to 150 references for a PhD. My first book has 1,000. Second book has over 600. The third book has something like 300. So, multiple PhDs worth of research in there. That's why I got, 2 shows on Gaia. That's why I'm on Ancient Aliens all the time, just like you are, George. We're, I don't know about you, buddy, but I mean, everywhere I go, people are like, oh, man, there you are. It's crazy what's happened in my life, especially in the last 6 months. It seems like everywhere I go, I'm now getting recognized. Everybody wants a photo. And I think that's just because I've done hard work, just like you have, George, for a long, long time. And I've just stayed in the game.
It pays off. It pays off.
It just took off.
You're getting the information. Let's go to Dennis in Idaho. Hi, Dennis. Thanks for calling.
Hi, guys. Hi, gentlemen. George, you amaze me with your knowledge about how the God of the Bible is depicted there as like a monster. It's a long, big discussion. You were spot on. George, I have a question for you first, the star of our show, our main guy, you and Tom. And then, David, I want to ask you a question about ascension, share something with you.
Okay.
Yeah, my first question to you, George, it's great hearing your voice. You guys are wonderful tonight. Your new book, I want to know about it, and where should I buy it?
Okay, very quickly, Night Talk. It's available at Amazon.com. It's the cheapest way. So you just go in there and type in 2 different words, Night Talk, and the book will pop up, and you can order it that way.
Cool. I read Worker in the Light, which was the other book you had before, and I really liked that. So I'm looking forward to seeing that.
That'll be fun. And go ahead, Dennis, with your question for David.
You guys are awesome tonight, yeah. And, George, thank you for what you're doing with the electromagnetic pulse weapon.
Oh, yeah. I'm not going to give up on
that. Take us out. That is so important. You're the star. That's awesome. What you're doing there. That would just take us out. So you're really doing something for all of us Americans. That's great. Thank you. David, my question to you, sir, you're amazing. I've studied reincarnation. I studied the world scholar, Dr. Ian Stevenson.
Oh, yeah. He's great.
Yeah. I'm sure. I know you know about it and everything. So
Absolutely.
When you read about you a long time ago about how you were, it could be Edgar Cayce reincarnated, it makes total sense to me.
So those who don't know, Dr. Ian Stevenson followed up on something like 3,000 different cases of children who allegedly remembered past lives.
Yes.
And then he found out that you could academically compare what they said to reality, and that they lined up, and also that in the cases where they did line up, because these 3,000 were the ones that worked, obviously some of them are not going to work, but a lot of them did, that these kids would actually look like the people they said they had been before. And the inheritor of Dr. Ian Stevenson's research is Dr. Jim Tucker, who I'm sure you've had on the show.
Yeah.
And he has now used police forensic face matching software to prove that people who are genuine reincarnations of someone else have such a strong facial similarity that they could literally be charged with the crime that they committed in a past life. And my facial similarity to Casey is absolutely undeniable. It's been verified by multiple experienced portrait artists, by an orthodontist, by many different people who have credentials, and we have this weird thing with the astrology where it's the only time in 127 years after Casey's death where my planets line up so well with his. I had to be born when I was for that to happen. The likelihood of the face match and the astrology coming together, we've calculated it as many billions to one against chance. It's just very unlikely that anything but the reincarnation hypothesis could be a factor in this.
Let's go to Tom in Maryland. Let's get a couple more calls in here before we are done. Hi, Tom. Go ahead.
Good morning, gentlemen. I'll make this quick so the other callers can get on. George, you're scaring me. You blaspheme the God of the Bible to the world. I'll pray for you, sir. I've been listening to you forever. I pray for you anyway.
Thank you. I'll take all the prayers I can get.
Mr. Wilcock, I was on your site, and I was wondering, information very interesting. You have information on DNA and purpose of life. I read a lot of the reviews, and they all seem very positive. I was wondering, though, I couldn't find a bibliography that stated where the information came from. Is this information just imparted to you, or are you relying upon scientific studies?
Oh, my gosh. Yeah.
I'll leave you with this. As far as the DNA is concerned, it has a directionality, and it usually exists as a double-stranded structure with both strands coiled together, but it's made up of different nucleotides. What have you found with the different DNA you mentioned as far as the nucleotides, and what are those ramifications? I'd like if you could expand just briefly on.
And you want me to have time for another caller, too? Wow.
No. This will be it. 2 minutes left. You're on.
Okay. So point number one, no, this is not just based on channeling or insider testimony. I don't think anybody, except for maybe Lynn McTaggart in her book The Field, and maybe the classic, there's some other classic books that talk about the holographic universe by Michael Talbot. That's one I'm thinking of. Hardly anybody's done as much academic research as I've done into DNA, and it's all based on science. And I will also point out, I have strived as much as possible to use references where if you buy the ebook, you can go into them and click on the links and read the website yourself. The really cool thing, and I'm sure, George, it works the same with your book, is people can now buy the audio version, which in my case I narrated it myself, and it will read it along with the ebook, so you can have it read to you, and it'll light up the words and stuff as it goes along. So you can buy them together and do that. It's really cool.
And by the way, the audio version is a lot of work, isn't it?
Oh, my gosh, yeah.
Your eyes start playing tricks with the copy.
It was a whole week of just grueling intensity, yes, but it was wonderful. I mean, I had a lot of fun. I laughed a lot. It was a very enjoyable experience for me. To get to the second question, he's talking about
30 seconds left.
DNA. We are, in fact, I'd like to refer back to the movie that I was in, Sirius, and I think, George, you might have been in that too.
Yes, I popped in.
Yeah, you were in there. And we, in that movie, described this little corpse that was 6 inches tall, humanoid,